By the time the owner's son called me just paperwork, I'd spent 23 years watching his father's company try to turn half-baked ideas into enforceable monopolies. I was there when the first flagship product was scribbled on a whiteboard with dry erase fumes and wishful thinking. I turned that into claims, drawings, prosecution histories, docket calendars, and on good days granted patents with teeth. The lobby called us an innovation company. The glass on the door said Helix Verge Technologies, all sleek chrome letters and a blue swoosh. Inside, the building smelled like carpet cleaner that never quite drowned out the scent of overheating electronics and burnt coffee. Legal was at the end of a corridor no one went down unless they had to. It smelled like paper, toner, and the despair of people who have spent too much of their life arguing about comma placement with examiners in Alexandria. The coffee was its own form of abuse. A commercial drip machine squatted on a laminate counter in the break room, stained glass pot half-glued to the hot plate with a ring of burned residue. Someone from facilities poured generic grounds into the basket every morning at 7 a.m. and let it bake to death. The result was a viscous, dark liquid that tasted like battery acid had taken a long bath in mud. First swallow coated my tongue in something metallic and bitter enough to peel enamel. It left a sludge taste at the back of my throat that even mint gum couldn't quite erase. I drank it anyway. You don't spend decades reading office actions and chasing inventors for signatures on decaf. I was the chief patent counsel on the organizational chart, which meant I sat at that intersection where engineering fairy tales met shareholder fantasies. They called me in when a product manager claimed they'd invented something that had existed in quietly published IEEE papers for 10 years, and when the CEO wanted to stand up in front of investors and say the word proprietary without getting sued. My team wrote the applications, argued with the USPTO, monitored competitors' portfolios, and filed the occasional infringement complaint when someone decided our claims were just suggestions. Mostly, though, my job was to be the person in the room who remembered that the value of a patent isn't that it exists, it's that you can enforce it when it matters. Helix Verge's flagship product, the one that put us on the stock tickers, was a smart grid edge controller, a sleek black box that sat inside utility cabinets and pretended to be the future. It watched voltage, current, phase angles, feeder loads, then sent signals to reclosers and regulators to shave peaks, island faults, and generally keep the lights on in a slightly more intelligent way than the 60-year-old iron we'd been coexisting with. The hardware was decent. The software was the story. The CEO liked to call it our brain at the grid edge. I called it a layered stack of algorithms I'd spent 5 years helping protect from anyone who thought copy-paste was business strategy. The core of that stack was something called adaptive topology transitioning, ATT in our shorthand. Engineers love their acronyms. ATT watched the network, predicted likely switching scenarios, and made real-time decisions about when to open or close certain devices to avoid overloads. In plain language, it stopped bad things before SCADA saw them. We had a portfolio of patents around it: broad independence, narrower dependence, region-specific variations. On paper, it was a moat you could drown a competitor in. In practice, the moat only holds if the title to the land on which it sits is clean. That's where the owner's son wandered in. He was called Chase because, of course, he was. Mid-20s, fresh MBA from a school that looks good on slide decks, 2 years at a consultancy known for telling companies to pivot to platform. His father, Victor, had started Helix Verge as an engineering outfit in a strip mall. By the time Chase showed up with his blue suit and his pitch decks, Victor was already half out the door mentally, thinking about foundations and golf courses. The board wanted a succession plan. They got a brand plan. Chase's title was VP of Strategy and Growth. Strategy meant he got to sit in on any meeting he wanted. Growth meant he had opinions about everything. He wore slim-cut suits in shades of navy and charcoal, always with a vest because someone had told him vests signaled serious. No socks, brown loafers, a watch with a skeleton face you could see the gears through, subtle enough to brag. He smelled faintly of something expensive, citrus and cedar layered over the base notes of the office, ozone from server rooms, old carpet, and the sour ghost of burnt coffee. He loved buzzwords the way litigators love billable increments. In the first exec offsite after he arrived, he put up a slide titled Helix Verge 3 and talked about synergy between IP and narrative, increasing velocity of innovation, pivoting from product to platform, and optimizing optics in the market. IP to him was a bullet point on a valuation slide. Patents were little gold stars you put next to a logo to impress bankers. He had no idea that the wrong word in a claim amendment could be the difference between throwing a competitor off a cliff and handing them a map around you. Our first collision was almost funny. He showed up at my door one afternoon, all smiles, a tablet tucked under his arm instead of a legal pad. My office smelled like old paper and the faint tang of ozone that leaked in from the server room next door through some crack in the HVAC. He sat without being invited, leaned back, ankle over knee, bare shin showing above his designer loafer, and asked, "So how fast can we juice the patent story?" He said investors loved IP and we had this whole wall of it. He gestured at the framed patents on my wall like they were diplomas in a dentist's office. "Can we tell a story where ATT is basically uncopyable, like we own the edge?" He actually said that, own the edge. I explained calmly that patents aren't deeds to physics. They're defined by claims. Claims live and die based on prior art and prosecution history. Every narrowing argument you make to get around prior art is a scar that limits you later. He nodded like he was following, then said, "Sure, but from an optics standpoint, it's basically ours. The lawyers take care of the rest, right? Paperwork." Not because it didn't land, but because you can't teach respect with a lecture, you teach it with consequences. The thing about ATT that mattered more than the math was its history. It wasn't born at Helix Verge. It was born in a scruffy little startup Victor had acquired 15 years back, a 3-person outfit called Topologic Dynamics. They had a prototype controller and a provisional patent application on an early version of the topology algorithms. When Helix Verge bought them, part of the deal was that the inventors assigned their rights to Victor's company. 2 of them did. The third, a stubborn, brilliant woman named Amarta, did not fully. Back then, I was a junior in the legal department. I reviewed the IP schedules in the acquisition agreement. I noticed that while 2 inventors had signed the assignment for the provisional, the third had only signed an employment agreement with future assignment obligations. The provisional morphed into a non-provisional with my help. Examiners weighed in, we made arguments, we narrowed claims, we got a patent. In the flurry, no one ever got a clean, separate assignment from her on the core method. It was a hole, a small, nasty one. We papered around it later with an internal confirmatory assignment where a VP in engineering signed on behalf of Topologic, which no longer existed, and I made a note in my private file, Inventor 3 unassigned on core ATT base. Watch chain of title. Topologic's code got refactored, rewritten, layered into new modules, slightly different algorithms, new claim sets. We built a decent fortress of follow-on patents around the original. The original, like many founding stones, sank under the weight of later work. But in every decisive litigation scenario you model, one asset always matters most. The base claim that all your continuations lean on. That unclean title sat in the back of my mind like a slow leak. Then Helix Verge started sniffing around a big licensing deal. A European grid equipment maker, Meridian Power Systems, wanted to license ATT for their own edge controllers. The number on the NDA was $400 million over 10 years. Chase saw it as his ticket, a megadeal he could hang his personal brand on. He plastered strategic ATT licensing across decks, talked about unlocking non-dilutive capital, and flew business class to Zurich to drink espresso and say synergy in conference rooms with views of mountains. Meridian's lawyers were not stupid. They hired a top IP firm to do diligence. Those lawyers did what I always wished more business people understood. They read the chain of title. They saw the base ATT patent, saw the old assignment from 2 inventors to Topologic, saw the on behalf of confirmatory we'd filed years later. They asked politely at first for the original executed assignment from Inventor 3. We didn't have it. They asked for clarification. We danced. I told Chase in as many words as the situation allowed that we had a gap we needed to plug before we made any representations to anyone, let alone as part of a $400 million deal. He waved it off. We've got 50 patents on ATT, he said, tapping a slide that showed a nice cluster of little rectangles around our logo. One missing signature on some ancient thing isn't going to scare them. He kept saying signature like it was a formality, not the legal transfer of title. I reminded him that if the base patent's ownership was clouded, any continuations claiming priority to it could be vulnerable in litigation. A smart infringer could argue they didn't have to license from us at all because the true owner wasn't at the table. He told me I was being overly cautious and that velocity mattered. Legal, he said, has to be a partner, not a break. Inventor 3, Amarta had left Helix Verge a decade earlier after some ugly politics in R&D. She'd taken her payout, her ideas, and as far as I knew, most of her pride. I'd stayed in touch in the way lawyers do, LinkedIn connections, the occasional conference nod across a room, 1 or 2 DMs when a competitor's filing crossed my desk that smelled like her. When I realized we needed a clean assignment, I pulled her old file. Her original employment agreement had invention assignment language, but it was state law messy and wouldn't impress Meridian's counsel. A direct assignment now from her to Helix Verge with some backdating of intent could shore things up if she signed. I asked Chase for permission to reach out formally to offer her a fee for a confirmatory assignment and maybe a consulting role. He rolled his eyes. We're not paying twice for the same IP, he said. Victor already bought that company, this is just paper catching up. Can't you just file something? I told him if we fabricated an assignment or backdated anything, we'd be handing opposing counsel a fraud claim. SEC would love that. So would Meridian when they wanted an excuse to walk or renegotiate. He called me doom and gloom, in a hallway not even in my office, loud enough that a couple of analysts looked up from their screens. You're just paperwork, he said. We need business solutions, not legal obstacles. The machine he thought he ran was built on paper, charters, contracts, claims. People like me kept that paper aligned with reality. People like him blurred it until you couldn't see the edge you were about to fall off. I called Amarta anyway, but as a human, not as Helix Verge. We met for coffee in a cafe that didn't taste like drill runoff. She looked older, of course, don't we all, but the eyes were the same, sharp, amused, faintly tired. I laid out the problem carefully, leaving out numbers but not stakes. She listened. Then she told me a story I didn't know. When Topologic was acquired, Victor had promised her something not written in the purchase agreement, a royalty share on any major licensing deal built on her core algorithm. A gentleman's agreement, he called it. Years later, when Helix Verge started making real money on ATT, that promise evaporated. She'd asked quietly to talk about recognition. She'd been told by a then-new VP of strategy that we don't do revenue shares for employees, this is all just part of your job. The confirmatory assignment someone in engineering had signed on behalf of Topologic had been pushed across her desk once half-filled, with the implication she should sign it for the team. She hadn't. She'd left instead. You know they've been licensing it without me for years, she said. You know they've stood on stages and called it theirs. I did, I'd written some of those talking points. So now they want my signature to make their deal clean, she asked. I nodded. Then they can pay me, she said, or they can live with their mess. My job, practically, was to protect the company from itself. Sometimes those two things aren't the same. The board signed the term sheet with Meridian on a Thursday. There was champagne in the executive conference room, cheap stuff pretending to be better in skinny flutes. The CEO made toasts, voice thick, about culmination of years of innovation. Chase smiled for photos, angle just so vest perfect, talking about synergy between two leaders. They all operated under an assumption baked into the reps that Helix Verge owned outright the core ATT IP. I sat at the end of the table, watching bubbles cling to the glass, tasting the afterburn of bad coffee mixing with cheap alcohol, and knew the assumption was, at best, optimistic. The following Monday, Meridian's counsel sent over the draft licensing agreement. It contained a representation clause that said Helix Verge represents and warrants that it is the sole and exclusive owner of all right, title, and interest in and to the licensed patents, free and clear of any liens, claims, or encumbrances. It also included an indemnity. If that representation was false and Meridian got sued, Helix Verge would cover their costs. I sent the draft back to Chase and the CEO with a cover memo flagging the chain of title issue in bold. I recommended we disclose the gap, commit to curing it via direct assignment from Inventor 3, and adjust the rep accordingly. I used words like material risk and potentially voidable. Meridian wanted to announce the deal on their next earnings call. Our stock had run up on rumor already. People wanted the press release. Legal words in a memo were friction. That's when Chase said the sentence that lit the fuse. If this is just about one inventor signature from a decade ago, we can clean that up after close. It's paperwork. Don't let legal torpedo a $400 narrative over optics. It was ownership, and if they signed that rep knowing there was a gap, it wasn't just bad lawyering, it was potential securities fraud. We'd be telling the market we had exclusive rights to something we didn't fully own. The room went quiet. Then Chase, voice cooler, said, "If you can't get comfortable with this, maybe you're not the right GC for where Helix Verge is going." He just promoted me to general counsel in his head for argument's sake. On paper, I was still chief patent counsel, but to him it was all the same, legal as obstacle. 2 weeks later, HR called me in. The HR director's office was down the hall from mine, but it might as well have been in a different building. It smelled like vanilla air freshener and staged sympathy. She had a manila folder on her desk, her fingers resting on it like it might jump. Chase sat in the corner chair, dressed in a lighter suit for summer, no socks, loafers gleaming, tablet balanced on one knee. HR did the script, restructuring, aligning our legal function with our strategic priorities, no reflection on your years of service. I'd heard versions of it before, delivered to other people. It was almost soothing to hear it pointed at me. You know where you stand when HR reads from a page. They were dissolving my role, moving to a more integrated external counsel model, Chase said, as if outsourcing everything would somehow make it cheaper or better. They'd keep a lean contracts function in-house. IP would be handled by outside experts. They offered a severance package that would have seemed generous to someone who hadn't watched them throw around six-figure retainers for consultants who produced nothing but slides. 12-month salary, accelerated vesting on some options, COBRA contributions. The usual NDA language about non-disparagement and company confidentiality. Tucked in there like an afterthought was a clause asking me to sign a confirmatory assignment of any and all inventions, improvements, and intellectual property rights related to ATT and any continuation in part or foreign equivalent to Helix Verge. There it was, the kill switch, not the patent itself. Those were largely in Helix Verge's name, not a physical key or a biometric scanner. A signature they wanted from the one person who could both bless their story and curse it, the company's own patent lawyer. My employment agreement had the usual assignment language, but it also had carve-outs negotiated years ago before Victor realized how valuable paper could be. There was a recognition that I did consulting and academic work outside my duties, that anything not specifically commissioned by Helix Verge and not using their resources would be mine. Over the years, I'd written a couple of law review articles and given talks about software patentability. One of those had morphed into a method claim around dynamic licensing of control algorithms. It never got filed because I knew the Supreme Court's appetite for such things would tank it. The concepts, though, had filtered into ATT's later variations. Enough that, if I wanted to be difficult, I could argue I had independent claims on some elements. I'd never weaponized that. It was theoretical leverage, until Chase tried to roll all of my brain into one omnibus assignment clause. I read the page slowly, the smell of burnt coffee lingering from the cup I'd carried in out of habit, battery acid and mud. I looked up. "No," I said, and slid that page back across the desk. HR blinked. "Is there a concern?" she asked, eyes a little too wide. "My counsel will review," I said. "I'm not signing away undefined rights in a blanket." Housekeeping deserves time, he shrugged, annoyed but not worried. Fine, he said, we can close the deal without it, don't overthink it. I went home with a cardboard box, my diploma frames, a coffee mug that said claims, not dreams, and a red folder I kept in the bottom drawer. Helix Verge ATT chain of title. Inside were copies of the old assignments, my memos flagging the gap, Meridian's due diligence questions, and the draft licensing agreement with my comments. I added the severance packet with the overreaching assignment clause just behind a printout of Chase's email calling me overly cautious for worrying about the unassigned inventor. Then I slid the folder into my safe next to my passport and the deed to my condo, paper and metal again. Helix Verge signed the deal with Meridian 3 weeks later. They went live on CNBC with it. Victor, looking older and a little bewildered by the camera, sat next to Chase, who did most of the talking. This validates our IP strategy, he said. We own the edge. The stock popped double digits. Analysts wrote notes about high-margin licensing streams. Our PR team emailed the link to every alumni list and local business journal. The licensing agreement quietly was executed with the representation clause still intact. No carve-out, no disclosure of the chain of title blemish. No mention of Inventor 3 or the unclean base patent. I watched the segment from my couch, the taste of decent coffee in my mouth instead of sludge, and felt equal parts relief and dread. Relief that the mess was no longer technically my problem. Dread because systems do care whose job it is when they break. The break didn't come from a lawsuit. It came from Meridian's own lawyers doing what lawyers do when they smell something off. In preparing to integrate ATT into their stack, they decided to file some new patents in Europe on implementation tweaks. Their European counsel, more meticulous than flattered, dug into the priority chain. They pulled the U.S. base patent file, saw the old provisional from Topologic, noted the inventors, and out of habit ran a cursory public records search on each name. 2 of them showed assignments to Helix Verge and then to its foreign subsidiaries. The third, Amarta, showed no such thing. What it did show was a small LLC she'd set up 5 years prior for IP consulting. Helix Verge's outside counsel forwarded the question to our, now their, skeleton in-house team. That team mostly contracts people who'd once reported to me had to go hunting for answers. They found my memos in the document management system because I'd labeled them properly. They found my flag about the unassigned inventor. They found the fact that I had refused to sign the omnibus assignment clause on my termination day. They elevated it to Chase, who, in a panic that looked suspiciously like an Excel error, wrote an email to outside counsel that said, "We believe this is just historical noise, not a real exposure." Can we characterize it as such? Counsel replied that no, you cannot characterize away chain of title issues if asked directly by a counterparty. At that point, Meridian's lawyers weren't asking politely anymore. They were hinting that misrepresentation could give them grounds to walk or renegotiate. That was when my phone rang, not my old office extension, my personal cell number used sparingly by people who understood boundaries. The caller ID showed Helix Verge's new general counsel, a man I respected who'd once been a partner at a litigation boutique we'd hired to crack competitor skulls. He didn't waste time. He said there was a situation involving ATT chain of title and the Meridian license. He asked carefully if I'd be willing to consult on it. I asked equally carefully in what capacity and at what rate. I'd had time in the week since being walked out to think about my price. I told him $10,000 an hour, $200,000 retainer up front, full indemnity for any testimony I might have to give, and no gag order on my right to speak about my time at Helix Verge in general terms. Also, one more thing. I wanted written acknowledgement in the engagement letter that I had previously raised the chain of title risk internally before the Meridian deal and had been overruled by business leadership. There was a pause, the sound of someone doing mental math against a clock. Then he said, "Send me your draft terms." The wire hit my account before dinner. As an external consultant, I came back into the building through the front door, visitor badge clipped to my blazer. The lobby smelled the same, industrial air freshener, faint ozone from the server room 1 floor down. The coffee machine burbled in the break room, still producing that same dark, bitter sludge. I poured a cup more out of muscle memory than desire. The first sip tasted like every late night I'd ever worked in that building. It also tasted now like billable time. We sat in a glass-walled conference room with a view of the parking structure. On the table, printed copies of the Meridian Agreement, the base ATT patent file histories, my old memos, and a fresh binder titled Chain of Title ATT Portfolio. Chase wasn't in the first meeting. This was grown-ups only, the new GC, outside counsel, CFO. They wanted my help in doing two things: mapping the exact scope of the chain of title exposure and figuring out a way to cure it quickly enough to keep Meridian from detonating the deal. I walked them through the history. Topologic acquisition, partial assignment, my note, the unassigned inventor, Meridian's question. I confirmed out loud what my memos already said. Helix Verge had a good faith belief at the time of filing that it owned enough rights to prosecute the patents, but it could not currently prove clean title to all claims without Amarta's cooperation. I stopped just shy of saying the word fraud about the representation clause, but the implication hung there like the lingering smell of coffee grounds in a drain. To cure it, they needed one thing: my signature. Not on an omnibus assignment giving them the universe, but on a very specific document that would assign any rights I might claim in any ATT-related invention, by virtue of my advisory work and unfiled ideas to Helix Verge, and critically, my agreement to assist them in getting a clean assignment from Amarta by testifying that the intent back then had been for all three inventors to give their rights to the company. My testimony could help them argue there was at least an equitable assignment, if not a legal one, buying them some comfort with Meridian. My price for that signature, beyond the per-hour fees, was simple. They were going to pay Amarta what Victor had promised her and never delivered. A royalty cut on the Meridian deal and any major ATT licenses going forward spelled out in ink. She had her own counsel by then. I made the introduction. It got messy. Meridian paused public celebration of the deal, put a bland line in their earnings call about continuing to finalize documentation. Helix Verge's stock, which had been happily inflated on the earlier CNBC segment, started to deflate as analysts parsed that sentence. A columnist in an industry blog hinted that an IP cloud hovered over the license. Investors hate clouds. Meanwhile, in R&D, word leaked that ATT's untouchable status was in fact touchable. Engineers started quietly asking whether they'd built their careers on sand. Morale, already brittle after a few too many velocity speeches, cracked a little more. Through it all, I billed $10,000 an hour to explain again and again that patents are not stickers you slap on marketing. They are property interests with chains of title that can strangle you if you ignore them. I reviewed draft responses to Meridian, stripped out self-serving adjectives, and replaced them with facts. I drafted a joint letter for Helix Verge and Amarta's new LLC clarifying the intent of the old assignment, offering a new one, and acknowledging a royalty interest. Meridian's counsel, after a few tight phone calls, accepted that solution. They amended the license, shaving a not insignificant amount off the total payment and adding an indemnity backstop tied to the new assignment. The deal survived, technically. The flagship product in the market's eyes did not. Helix Verge had built its story on ATT being wholly owned, defensible, and unique. The amended disclosure documents made that sound more like jointly held for a time, belatedly papered, and slightly messy. Meridian's analysts raised questions about how core the IP really was if ownership had been that fuzzy for that long. Competitors pounced. One filed an IPR petition poking at our priority claims, citing the chain of title drama as evidence of uncertainty. Another started marketing their own edge controller as built on clean, in-house IP. Sales teams who used to swagger into pitches with "we own the edge" on their lips began hedging. You can't unring a bell, you can only try to talk over it. As for Chase, the board needed someone to bleed. They weren't going to publicly flog the company's own former patent lawyer. That would invite questions about why they'd ignored my warnings. The new GC was too new. The CFO had numbers to hide behind. The owner's son, on the other hand, had put his face on the CNBC clip and his signature on the board memo downplaying the chain of title risk. Helix Verge issued a terse internal email a month after the amended deal closed. Effective immediately, Chase will be stepping down from his role as VP of Strategy and Growth to pursue new opportunities. Word around the office was that Victor had finally, quietly, told his son that brand wasn't enough if you didn't understand the paper under it. I stayed on as an external consultant far longer than the crisis strictly required. They decided they liked having someone on call who'd read all the boring parts in advance. We formalized the arrangement, a standing $200,000 quarterly retainer for IP strategy and crisis counsel, plus the same $10,000 hourly rate for active engagements. I worked from my own office now, a quiet space that smelled like actual wood and good coffee instead of toner and despair. The only sludge in my life was on the pages of old office actions. Sometimes, when a junior in-house counsel calls me, voice a little tight, asking whether some new product name might infringe or whether an inventor's departure memo needs a closer read, I think about how this all looked from the outside. To most of the company, the flagship product died when the story about shoddy IP leaked and Meridian trimmed the license. In reality, the boxes kept shipping, the controllers kept doing their quiet work in cabinets on poles and in basements. It was the aura that died, the illusion of invincibility built on half-understood patents and a son who thought paperwork was beneath him. The owner's son called the patent lawyer just paperwork. My signature given on my terms at my rate didn't just kill their flagship story. It forced them to live in the world I'd inhabited all along. One where details matter, ownership isn't assumed, and the machine you're really maintaining isn't the servers in the next room, but the pile of paper and promises that tell the outside world what you actually own. They still sell controllers, Meridian still sends royalty checks, Amarta gets her slice now, I get mine. And every time I see Helix Verge on a conference agenda bragging about IP excellence, I smile into my cup of coffee that doesn't taste like battery acid and remember that, in the end, the quiet people who read the fine print hold the sharpest levers.